All right, let's dive into something kind of, I don't know, a little bit controversial maybe. The Quran's perspective on war. For some people, the Quran might seem like a whole other world, but we're going to try to break it down for you today. We're looking at excerpts from a tafsir, basically like a guidebook to the Quran, so we can understand what it says about war.
Yeah, and it's important to remember with the Quran, you need interpretation. It's not just like a set of rules.
Exactly. So one thing that really surprised me reading these excerpts, the Quran, like, it doesn't glorify war. Peace is really the ideal.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Quran talks a lot about peace and reconciliation, and it really pushes Muslims to try to resolve conflicts peacefully, even when they've been wronged.
That's really interesting because
Uh,
a lot of people think that Islam is all about violence.
it's a common misconception, but forgiveness and compassion are very important in the Quran, even towards your enemies.
So if peace is the ideal, then when is war actually allowed?
That's the key question. The Quran says war is only okay in very specific situations, like self-defense, for example. If a community is attacked, they have the right to defend themselves.
It seems like it's very connected to justice. Like, it's not just revenge, it's about, like, restoring balance when there's been aggression.
Absolutely. And that idea of justice goes beyond just self-defense. The Quran also allows war to protect vulnerable people who are being oppressed.
So kind of like a humanitarian intervention almost.
Yeah, you could say that. Stepping in to protect those who can't protect themselves.
So there's a lot of talk about just war theory. Is there something similar in Islam?
Yeah, there is. It's called kitl, which means warfare. And just like just war theory, there are specific conditions that have to be met for it to be allowed.
Like what?
Well, one of the most important things is that war has to be a last resort. You have to try everything else to resolve the conflict peacefully at first.
Makes sense. Like in just war theory, where war can't be for personal gain, right?
Right. And just like in just war theory, Islam also stresses proportionality.
Proportionality.
Yeah, meaning the force you use has to match the threat you're facing. You can't use excessive force or cause unnecessary destruction.
So it's not about wiping out the enemy. It's about, like, restoring peace and justice.
Exactly. The Quran says it's important to minimize casualties and protect innocent people.
Wow, that's interesting. There's a lot of nuance here, a lot of ethical considerations.
Oh, absolutely. And these principles, they came about in a specific time period, but scholars still debate and interpret them today.
Yeah, it's not just ancient history. It's still relevant.
Right.
Before we move on, I want to talk about one word, jihad. It's a word you hear a lot, and usually not in a good way. So what does it actually mean?
It's a word that's often misunderstood, especially in the media. Jihad just means struggle or striving. And it can mean a lot of different things, both internal and external.
So not just about fighting.
Right. There's the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is about your internal struggle. It's about fighting your own bad desires and habits, trying to be a better person.
So more like self-improvement.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about the lesser jihad?
The lesser jihad is about the external struggle. And that can include defensive warfare, but only in those very specific situations we talked about. But the Quran is very clear. No aggression, no conquest, no forcing anyone to convert to Islam.
So jihad as a holy war where anything goes. That's just wrong.
It's a dangerous misrepresentation of what the Quran actually teaches. Jihad is about striving for what's right and just.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Understanding these words and their context, that's really important.
Definitely. And as we continue this deep dive, we'll keep looking at these ideas and exploring all the different layers of Islamic thought on this topic.
This is already so insightful. I can't wait to keep going.
Welcome back.
I'm ready for more.
Yeah.
In part one, we talked about, like, the general principles, but I want to know how they actually work in real situations. Can we look at some examples from the tafsir?
Yeah, definitely. One passage that stood out to me was about prisoners of war.
Oh, yeah. There were some pretty specific rules about that, right?
Yeah. The Quran says you have to treat prisoners with dignity and respect, no matter what they believe or what they did during the war.
That's kind of surprising, isn't it?
Uh,
I mean, during a war, you'd think there would be a lot of anger towards the enemy.
You'd think so. But the Quran tells Muslims to be compassionate and fair, even during conflict. For example, you can't torture prisoners. You can't humiliate them. You have to give them food, water, and shelter.
Wow, that's amazing. It almost sounds more like, I don't know, a humanitarian effort than a war.
It's about minimizing suffering, even in the toughest situations.
It's like there's this recognition that everyone is human, even your enemies.
Exactly. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity.
So treating prisoners humanely, that's clear. What about how the war is actually fought? Are there rules about that?
Oh, absolutely. The Quran has specific rules about warfare, even about the types of weapons you can use.
Really? Like what?
Well, remember, force is always a last resort, and you have to try to minimize harm to civilians. Weapons that cause mass destruction are generally not allowed.
So like nuclear weapons.
Yeah, things like that.
It's about fighting ethically, protecting innocent lives. Are there like specific tactics that are forbidden?
Yes, for example, you can't mutilate the bodies of enemy soldiers.
Wow, that's intense.
It's about respecting human life, even in war. You also can't destroy crops, trees, or infrastructure. War should be targeted. You want to avoid unnecessary damage.
So it's not just chaos and destruction.
No, the Quran wants to bring order and morality to the battlefield.
You know, a lot of these principles, they sound similar to international laws of war.
That's right. The Quran's teachings came first. But there are a lot of similarities, like the Geneva Conventions, for example.
It's like there's a universal moral code.
I think you're right. The Quran points to a deeper understanding of human dignity and ethical behavior.
Okay, so we talked about prisoners of war and the conduct of war. What about after the war ends? What does the Quran say about reconciliation?
It stresses forgiveness and reconciliation. Muslims are encouraged to seek peace and to rebuild relationships that were broken by the conflict.
So no holding grudges.
The Quran says that kind of thinking is destructive. It's about healing and moving forward.
That's powerful. So the Quran isn't just about winning wars. It's about building a better world afterwards.
Exactly. True victory is about achieving lasting peace and restoring justice for everyone.
Okay, we've covered a lot. But you mentioned earlier about different interpretations of the Quran.
Right, it's important to remember that. The Quran is a complex text, and it's been interpreted in many different ways throughout history.
So, like, there isn't one right way to understand it.
Not exactly. The core principles are generally agreed upon: justice, peace, ethical conduct. But how they're applied, that can vary. It depends on the context and the school of thought.
It's like any religious text.
There are different interpretations.
It's important to understand that diversity of perspective.
Absolutely. To avoid oversimplification.
This has been so insightful. We talked about the rules, the challenges, and the different interpretations. I feel like we've only just begun to explore this.
We have, but it's been a great deep dive.
And for our listeners out there, I hope this encourages you to keep learning about this topic. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the rules and the principles, but I want to touch on something else before we wrap up, something a little more, I guess, spiritual. Like, how does the Quran's idea of God, of Allah, play into all of this? How does that influence its view on war and peace?
That's really important. In Islam, Allah is seen as the source of peace and mercy and justice. So war is never something you want, you know? It's always a last resort, only when peace has been broken and justice is threatened.
So even when it's allowed, it's not about, like, revenge or anything like that.
No, not at all. The goal is to restore peace, to make things right, to protect people who are being harmed. It's about fighting against evil, not becoming evil yourself. It's kind of like, when a surgeon has to operate, they have to cut, they have to remove something that's not healthy, but the goal is always to heal, to make the patient better.
Yeah, I get it. Even in war, you're trying to bring back peace and well-being.
Exactly. And you're always accountable to Allah for your actions. You have to follow His guidance, even in battle.
It's not just about the rules. It's about doing what's right in God's eyes.
Right. You're always answerable to Allah.
That's a powerful reminder. War isn't just about humans. It's about something bigger. Now, I'm curious about different cultures. Islam is practiced all over the world. Do these principles get applied differently in different places?
That's a good question, and it's true that culture and politics can influence how these teachings are understood. Different societies might have different ideas about what a just war is, or how to apply certain rules. It's like, think of a recipe. You have the basic ingredients, the instructions, but every chef might make it a little differently, add their own touch.
So the core principles are the same, but how they're expressed can change.
Exactly. You can't just make general statements about Islam. You have to look at the context, the culture, the history.
This has been amazing. We've talked about so much. The ethics, the challenges, the different interpretations, the spiritual side of it. It's been a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah, it's been a great deep dive.
So what's the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think it's this. Approach the Quran with an open mind. Be willing to learn. It's a really complex book with a lot of wisdom about war and peace, but it's not something you can just sum up in a few sentences.
It makes you think. It makes you
D-
question your assumptions.
And it encourages dialogue and understanding.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. We hope you learned something new today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working for a more peaceful world. This has been The Deep Dive, and we'll see you next time.